Welcome to another Through the Bible teaching, verse by verse through the Bible. We're now in Genesis chapter 37. And I tell you, this is some of my favorite things to teach on. Joseph has been a huge influence, the things that God did in his life and applying it to me. As a matter of fact, in reading these verses and getting ready for this teaching today, God spoke some awesome things to me, things I've been praying about for a year. And I believe He gave me revelation. And so I say this nearly every time, but one of the reasons that some people don't get much out of the Bible is because they're just reading it like a history book about what happened thousands of years ago. But you have to read it, opening up your heart and asking God to teach you through these things. And again, God has just spoken to me just this last weekend through this very powerfully. And I tell you, I love the character of Joseph. Joseph is one of just a very few people in the Bible that didn't have major flaws represented. Now, some people may disagree with that because they've been taught that Joseph was an arrogant brat and that God had to break him and sell him into slavery, and God did all of these things to break him. I think that is a totally wrong take on this, and as we go through, I'll be showing you these things from Scripture. But I just love Joseph, and God has used this in my life big time. I do have a lot of teaching on this. I've got a book on this, Lessons from Joseph. I've got CDs, DVDs, and a USB, and you can get all of those materials. And also, I'm taking my teaching from the Living Commentary, and this is my verse-by-verse commentary on over 28,000 verses that I've written footnotes on. And a lot of the things I'll be talking about today, I won't take time to verify every single thing, but if you got the commentary, it would have all of the notes in there and the references, and it would be, if you want to study something and really verify it, that would be the way to do it. So we're now in Genesis chapter 37, and in verse 1 it says, "And Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan." And in verse 2, "These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report." This verse is really important because it gives the age of Joseph when these dreams came to him. As we go on through this, when you get into chapter 41, you'll find that Joseph was 30 years old when he actually stood before Pharaoh. And so that's 13 years later is when his life really began to turn around. This is going to become very important, so remember these things. And then again, it will say that he was 22 years old when all of these dreams that he had actually it would have been 22 years. He would have been 39 years old, and so it was 22 years after these dreams when everything began to come to pass. Also, let me just point out, it says that he was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, and these were concubines, or they were slaves to his two wives, Leah and Rachel. And as we go into these next verses, this is some of the things that people misunderstand about Joseph. They will say that Joseph was an arrogant, spoiled kid. He was the favorite son of his father, and so God had to break him. I'm going to give you a new take on this based on what I believe these scriptures say. In verse 3 here, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him." So this verse, Genesis 37:4, makes it very clear that the reason his brothers hated him was because of the favoritism that Jacob showed unto Joseph. So this is not imputing to Joseph any fault on his own that caused his brothers to hate him. Now, when he had these dreams and he revealed how that God was going to exalt him, it says they hated him the more. But I think the worst that we can attribute unto Joseph is just he was 17 years old. He may not have had enough wisdom to know that just saying what had happened to him would aggravate this situation. I think the worst we can impute unto him would just be immaturity or being naive, but certainly not anything malicious. That's completely inconsistent with everything else that these scriptures show about him. And let me point out that this is another reason that polygamy, even though it was allowed under the Old Testament, and Jacob had 12 children by 4 different wives. And of course, Abraham, he also had multiple wives. David had 13 wives. Solomon had 1,000 wives, 700 wives and 300 concubines. So it was allowed, and Jesus said it was because of the hardness of people's hearts. You can see that it never was God's best. Jesus made that very clear, that from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. I think that's Matthew chapter 19 that he said that. And he just intended for one man to have one wife. And part of the reason that these people hated him is, we've already been through these in previous chapters, but it says that Jacob hated Leah. And that Leah was, many of the names of her children were all about, now he will dwell with me. Now I've been judged, and all of these things. And it says because she realized that her husband hated her. And so Leah bore 6 of the sons of Jacob. And then her handmaid Zilpah bore, I think, 2 more. So there was a total of the 8 of the 12 sons that were born to Jacob, that were born of these wives that were rejected and hated by Jacob. And certainly Rachel and her children were preferred. And so this shows you the conflict, the jealousy that happens. Proverbs 13:10 says, only by pride comes contention. And the strife and the contention came because of multiple wives, because one was favored over the other. And now Jacob has a son that is favored over all of the others. And this verse makes it very clear that the reason they hated him was because of the favoritism of Jacob. So there's multiple lessons to learn. One is, don't have multiple wives. The contention, the strife is not good. But also this shows that it was because of Jacob exalting Joseph to this position that it caused a lot of this problem. And so we need to get to where we love all of our children the same. Certainly they don't act the same. They got different personalities. But it's necessary for parents to not show favoritism over their children. This, I believe that Jacob, or Israel, his name was changed to, Jacob is the one who bore responsibility for starting this hatred of these brothers. And in verse 5 it says, and Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. Now again, in verse 4, they had already hated him. So I don't believe that this was Jacob, or excuse me, it wasn't Joseph just going around bragging and putting down his brothers. His brothers already hated him. And when he just told the dream, and again, I think it would be inconsistent to say that he was a spoiled brat and that he was somehow or another taking the favor that his father had given him and the favor that God had given him and using it to rub the brother's nose in it, and he caused these things. I've heard people teach that, but that is not what this is saying. Again, he might have been immature and just didn't realize that by him just sharing what God had spoken to him, that it would make other people hate him even the more. But verse 4 says they hated him because of the father and the way that he showed favoritism to him. And in verse 6, he said unto them, hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. Again, if you were to get my living commentary, this goes into more detail than what I'm going to do right here, but I've got references to footnotes that I've written in Matthew chapter 1 where I have a whole explanation of how many times God spoke to people by dreams in the Bible, and there's multiple times. He even spoke to foreign kings. He spoke to Nebuchadnezzar and others through dreams. So dreams is one of the ways that God speaks to us. I've got things in there about how to interpret dreams, and there's just a lot of information. I'm not going to take time to go into it. But Joseph is a person who God not only spoke to him and revealed his will to Joseph through dreams, but then Joseph interpreted the butler and the baker's dreams, which wound up all coming true and ultimately catapulted him into a position where he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. So there are 6 dreams recorded in the life of Joseph that were super significant. And this is one of them. Notice that it says that these sheaves bowed down to Joseph's sheaves. All of the brothers' sheaves bowed down to Joseph. I think it's really significant that God used sheaves to illustrate this, because when the famine came, it was going to be about all of the wheat and all of the corn and the things that were harvested, and that was going to be the key to what God had called Joseph to do. So the very fact that he used these sheaves that had been bound in a field, kneeling down, is significant. And I'll make a bigger deal of this as we go further into this, but when they bowed down, it wasn't just the physical act of bowing the knee to Joseph, but Joseph read into this correctly, that this was talking about these brothers finally bowing the knee, not only to Joseph, but to God. And I'll be explaining this more as we go through this, but these brothers were evil men that had murdered. I mean, not just in self-defense, but murdered hundreds of people who had committed incest. Reuben committed incest with his own stepmother. Judah committed incest with his daughter-in-law that will be explained in the next chapter. These were evil men. And for them to be the foundation of the nation of Israel, something had to change. And God used Joseph to not only physically bring these people to bow down their knee, but he used Joseph to break these people and to get them to humble themselves. And Judah, the one who committed incest with his own daughter-in-law, he wound up saying, "Take me and let all of the others go free." And of course, Jesus said, "No greater love hath any man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." And so Judah had a total transformation from then being this evil person that was going to burn his daughter-in-law to death with fire. He changed completely to being a person that would lay his life down for his brothers. And so this, when it says that they bowed down, it's more than just the physical act. It's talking about in their heart they bowed down. So in verse 8, here's the reaction of his brothers when he told them this. It says, "And his brothers said unto him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us?" You know, those are two questions. And of course, they assumed that the answer to that was no, but the answer to that was yes. You know, before you get upset at what somebody is saying, you better make sure that what they're saying isn't true. They just, out of hand, rejected this, that Joseph would ever be exalted over them. But that's exactly what came to pass. And so it goes on to say, "And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words." But they were totally unjustified. Everything he was saying was absolutely true. It was a revelation that came to him by dreams through God, and before they rejected the revelation, they should have checked their own heart to make sure it wasn't true, because it was true, and it came to pass just exactly the way he dreamed it. In verse 9, it says, "And he dreamed yet another dream, and told his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance unto me. And he told it to his father and his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth?" So Jacob basically interpreted this dream, saying that when it said that the sun and the sun would have been the father, the moon would have been the mother, and the 11 stars would have been his 11 brothers coming and bowing down to him. And so Jacob basically interpreted the dream. It made it very clear what he was talking about. Now, Joseph's mother, Rachel, had actually died by this time. She wasn't alive, but he had 3 stepmothers, and so that could have been what this is referring to. But anyway, this is definitely talking about the same thing that the first dream was. And when you get into the 41st chapter, when Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream, Pharaoh had 2 dreams that were basically saying the same thing using different illustrations. And Joseph specifically said, because the dream was doubled, therefore it is established and it cannot be changed. And this is one of the things that I've learned through this, that God speaks to me through dreams all the time. It's probably every week, or at least every couple of weeks. I mean, God says something specific to me through dreams. And here's one of the things when it comes to interpreting dreams. He says when something is doubled, you have 2 separate dreams, and yet they are making the exact same point. He says it's because that thing is established and it will certainly come to pass. So this is one of the keys to interpreting dreams. When the same point is made and just illustrated through different things, that's from God, and that means that that thing is established. And again, I've got more footnotes on this over in the New Testament, but not every dream is from God. If some dreams are just pizza dreams, I mean, they make no sense whatsoever, but there are dreams that are significant, and when they are the exact same thing being said and just established from different ways, that's because it's been established. Now, those are things that come from God. When God gives you a dream and doubles it, that's because it's established and it's going to happen. If Satan is the one tormenting you with dreams and fear and things like that, you can always overcome Satan's dreams. In verse 11, it says, "And his brothers envied him, but his father observed the same." This is talking about these two dreams. And so Jacob rejected him and rejected the dreams and rebuked him for it. But this verse says he observed the same. This would be similar to Joseph and Mary when, they had Jesus and they had lost him in Jerusalem, and they went back and found him and they rebuked him. It says, "We were worried about you." And he said, "Don't you understand that I must be about my Father's business?" And it says that Mary observed the saying. And I believe that that's the same thing that's right here. In other words, Jacob protested, and on the surface, he rejected what his son said. But in his heart, it says he observed the saying. So it had some impact on him. And if he would have taken what God had given him right here, this could have helped him through these 22 years that he thought that his son was dead. He could have said, "But I have a word from God," and it could have mitigated his suffering that he was going through, and he could have had hope that somehow or another Joseph was still alive. So anyway, God gave him an opportunity right here, but Jacob didn't take it. In verse 12, it says, "And his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem." And Shechem, if you remember, I think it's back in chapter 34, that the brothers went into Shechem and they killed every male in the entire city. It could have been hundreds of people. They murdered them. And then they took all the women and children and all the cattle and all of the gold and silver as spoil. And so this was the place where all of that took place. And his brothers went back there and they were feeding their flocks there. Jacob had bought a parcel of land. So they did have some land in this area of Shechem, and that may have been the reason that they were there feeding the flock. But it was about 100 miles away from Hebron and away from where Jacob and the rest of his family were living. So the brothers were about 100 miles away from home, feeding these flocks. And it says in verse 13, "And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, Here am I. And in verse 14, "And he said to him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again." So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now again, you got to remember, this was about 100 miles away. Joseph was 17 years old at this time, according to verse 2. And here he is sending a 17-year-old on a 100-mile trip. And either children at that time were a lot more responsible than children are today, or this could have been naive, maybe possibly neglect on Jacob's part to put this on his son. Plus, Jacob should have known that Levi and Simeon, as well as Reuben and Judah and some of the other brothers, had gone in and killed every single person in the city of Shechem. They were mean, evil people. These were not godly people. They were evil people. And Jacob should have known this about his sons and what they were capable of. And I think that somebody should have seen this coming. The way that the brothers, the previous verses here say that they hated him, again, I think that Jacob, in his old age, he preferred Joseph above all the other brothers, which wasn't smart. And then here he is sending Joseph into the lion's den, sending him into the midst of people that hated him and wanted to kill him. And I think that Jacob, or Israel, should have known better than this. In verse 15, "And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, What seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks." Did you know all of the sons of Jacob were well known in this area? Again, this is the area where they went in and killed every single man, and they took all the women, children, and cattle captives. And so people knew about Joseph's about Joseph's brothers, Jacob's sons here. And so they were well known. This person had seen them there. And in verse 17, it says, the man said, they are departed hence, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. Later on, hundreds of years later, Dothan is the place where Elisha and his servant Gehazi were surrounded by the Syrians, and he prayed that God would open up the eyes of the servant. And there were horses and chariots of fire surrounding them, and he took the entire Syrian army captive. Now, that's hundreds of years later, but it's just interesting to see that some of the great examples, great things that happened in the Bible happened in this one place. In verse 18, it says, and when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. You know, when they saw him afar off, he was wearing this coat of many colors, and so it was kind of a giveaway. He didn't have to get close before they recognized who it was. And the fact that it says they conspired against him means that they plotted this murder, and it was something that was premeditated. The definition of murder versus like manslaughter or something like that is murder is malice or intent to hurt somebody with thought, in advance, premeditated murder. When somebody accidentally slays somebody in a car wreck or something like that, that's what they call manslaughter. But so premeditated murder is worse than just when you accidentally do something, or if in just a flesh flash you lose your temper and do something. That's separate. This was premeditated. They planned on murdering him, and that again just reveals the evil that was in their heart. In verse 19, they said one to another, behold, this dreamer cometh. And the fact that they even referred to him as a dreamer, again, shows how much they hated him for the thought that he would somehow or another be exalted and prevail above them. They hated that. And so that was, as it goes on to say in Proverbs 13:10, only by pride comes contention. When you are in pride, when you are looking at everything from yourself and just exalting yourself and thinking only about yourself, that's the source of all contention. And certainly we can see that right here. In verse 20 it says, come now therefore, let us slay him and cast him into some pit, and we will say some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what shall become of his dreams. This is just evil, that they would kill their own brother just because they envied him, because their father had preferred him. Again, I think that Leah may have passed down to all of her children how she was hated and how she was rejected and how the children of Rachel were preferred. And because of this, it was like a cascading, snowballing effect. This hatred had been festering for probably decades, and it just festered and manifested itself right here. And they were willing to kill him, thinking that they could stop his dreams from coming true. In verse 21, and Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him. And here's what Reuben was planning on doing, that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver him to his father again. So again, for those of you that aren't real familiar with the scripture, Reuben was the firstborn son that Jacob had. He was born of Leah, and Reuben is the one who went in and committed incest with one of his father's wives. So Reuben was not a real godly person by any stretch of the imagination, but he did not consent to the potential murder of Joseph. And he said, just cast him into this pit. And he had planned on when he got a chance to go deliver Joseph out of the pit and bring him again to his father. So Reuben in this situation is the only one of the 10 brothers that were here that did not want to murder Joseph. And in verse 23, it says, it came to pass when Joseph was come unto his brethren that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes. Before I get into the rest of this verse, let me just say that here they've taken their brother, and they planned on killing him, but instead, because of Reuben's intercession, they just threw him into a pit. But he could have died in this pit. He could have broken bones. As far as they knew, they didn't know that Reuben was planning on rescuing him, so they just planned on letting him die in this pit. This is evil, 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 and yet these guys, right after doing that, were sitting down and eating like nothing had happened. They were probably rejoicing. Again, this shows how evil their heart is, and this is setting up all of the things that all of the things that Joseph does when his brothers finally come to buy corn in the land. He did these things not out of vengeance, not trying to get even with his brothers, but he was trying to break this evil streak in them, bring them to the end of themselves, and he realized that God had put him in a position where his brothers were not only going to bow the knee physically, but they were going to bow their heart, and God was going to use him to change these men's heart because they were the foundation of the nation of Israel. So this is really interesting to see that they just sat down to eat their bread, and they looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren. Now Judah is the one that in the next chapter winds up wanting to burn his daughter-in-law to death, and then he found out that he was the father of the child that she had, and he wound up having incest, committing incest with his own daughter-in-law. And so this Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? You know, it says over in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, that the love of money is the root of all evil. That doesn't mean that God causes this love of money, but God can use a person's bent towards, man, they are just constantly doing whatever it takes to advance themselves to get more money and things like this. And I believe he played on the evilness in these people's heart and used this to be able to deliver Joseph out of their hand and sell him into slavery. And so God used this. In verse 27 it says, come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. So they were acting like this was somehow or another a more noble thing to do. What this does reveal is that in their heart they knew what they were doing wrong. And so here they saw an opportunity to make some money off of him and at the same time soothe their conscience a little bit. But it reveals what it says in Romans 1, 18 through 20, that God has an intuitive knowledge, a conscience on the inside of every single person of right and wrong against all ungodliness and all unrighteousness of man. And so this is reflected right here. In verse 28 it says, then there passed by Midianites. You know, Midianites and Ishmaelites were cousins. And so really, they could have been traveling together. It refers to them as Ishmaelites in one verse and Midianites in the other, but they were cousins. They were really the same family. They were all descendants of Abraham. They were very close cousins to all of these Israelites. So in verse 28, then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Again, many people take this, and people who believe in the sovereignty of God, that God just controls everything, and so that all sickness, all poverty, all hurt, all pain, everything is ordered by God. They will use this, and later on Joseph will even say this, that God is the one who sent him into Egypt to preserve many lives as it was that day. So in this instance, yes, it is true that God is the one that led these brothers not to kill Joseph, but to sell him into slavery. And so some people think, well, that's terrible. See how God does these bad things? But you've got to remember that these brothers were intent on killing Joseph. This was actually an act of mercy. God does not move independent of us. He flows through people. And I believe that if the brothers hadn't been so evil, there might have been another way to have gotten all of this accomplished. But God doesn't just steamroll us and overrun our will. He flows through people. And this actually was a superior way of dealing with Joseph, selling him into slavery, than leaving him with these brothers that sooner or later would have killed him. So if you look at the options that were available, this actually was a better option than leaving Joseph in the hand of all of these evil brothers who had already killed hundreds of people and had already shown that there was nothing that they wouldn't do. I believe that this was an act of mercy to get Joseph out from under his brothers and out of that house and put him in the area where God had planned on using him decades later. And so in verse 29 it says, "And Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes." Rending your clothes was a sign of grief, and so he just literally was so grief-stricken, thinking that somehow or another the brothers had killed Joseph, that he tore his clothes. So there's no way that he could have hidden his intent from his brothers because his clothes were rent. And so that shows that to the other brothers that Reuben was going to deliver them, and it showed that Reuben wasn't with them in this. But as the story goes on, they went back and lied to their father, Jacob, about what had happened to Joseph. And Reuben, even though he wasn't content or in agreement with killing Joseph, he was in agreement in concealing what really happened. He could have told his father, Jacob, the truth, and he could have saved 22 years worth of grief in Jacob's life, but he didn't do it. So even though Reuben wasn't as bad as the other brothers, he basically became complicit with them in this deception that they had. And there are many scriptures, I won't take time to turn over to them, but it talks about that if we don't speak up when we see evil, that we also get judged for the evil that takes place. And Numbers chapter 30 is one of those instances that shows that, but there's a lot of places. And so even though Reuben may not have been wanting to murder Joseph, he certainly was complicit in these lies, and so he had guilt associated with this too. And in verse 31, "And they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, This we have found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no." And so Joseph's brother here, they lied. They said, "We found this." They didn't just find it. They stripped it. They knew exactly what happened. They let Jacob jump to a conclusion. And Jacob goes on and says some terrible things here. Let me just read this. In verse 33, this is talking about Jacob, or Israel as his name was changed to. It says, "He knew it and said, It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured Joseph, is without doubt rent in pieces." Did you know that this is what his brothers were hoping that he would see? So they kind of pushed him in this direction towards this conclusion. But Jacob jumped to a conclusion that was completely wrong. Evil beast did not kill his son. His son was not dead, and yet he jumped to a conclusion and he made a decision. And he goes on to say in verse 34, "And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him." Boy, there are so many things that you can learn through this. I'm not going to take time to turn over there, but again, if you were to get my living commentary, I've got all of these verses listed, and it would really, really help you. But there are many instances, like when Joseph died, it talks about the days of mourning were over. You can go through a number of things. When Miriam died, when the days of mourning were over. Did you know you should not just be mourning the loss of people for the rest of your life, like Jacob says right here? Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying you ever get to where you forget them. I'm not saying that you ever get to where everything is just fine and it's as if they never lived. No, you can miss a person. You can honor that person's memory. But to just be in mourning for the rest of your life is wrong. Even in secular societies, I've read things about other societies, and in some cases they had a 30-day maximum mourning period that they allowed people, and after that you had to go back to work and start doing things. Even people without the Lord put an end to mourning. You just don't spend the rest of your life mourning over something. If you're watching this and if you are a person who is just mourning and you've been mourning for years, you may think that I'm rebuking you. I'm not rebuking you. I'm just saying that that is not a healthy way to live. And especially for those of us that have been born again and Jesus bore our sorrows and carried our griefs, Paul said that we should not mourn as others who have no hope. man, we need to let God comfort us. He is the comforter. The Holy Spirit is called the comforter. We need to cast all of our care upon Him. And again, I'm not saying that you ever get to where you don't miss that person. You know, my father has died. My mother has died. My sister has died. A girl that I was engaged to died, and I honestly thought I would not survive that. But you know what? I've gone on past that. My brother was very close to his wife, and she had arthritis and she was unable to do everything. So to a degree, he took care of her. And I mean, he just really loved his wife, and she died in a car wreck. And I mean, for a number of months, I can't remember exactly how many, but for a number of months, he just mourned. And I'd call him and try and minister to him, and he was not doing well. And then one day I called him, and he was just back to his normal self, and he was positive, and he was happy and talking about things. And I asked him, I said, what happened to you? And he said, God finally spoke to him, and he says, you either have to dig a hole next to your wife and crawl in and die, or you need to get on with your life. He says, you cannot spend the rest of your life mourning. And so he just literally cast his care about that over on the Lord, and he got over it. And in about a year and a half or 2 years, something like that, he remarried. He's now been remarried for, I think, 20 years, and he's just doing well, and he's blessed. And so this is one thing to learn, is that you just can't go down to your grave mourning. That's not a godly thing. And another thing to learn is that he was mourning over something that didn't even happen. Now, there had been a tragedy happen with the way the brothers treated Joseph and sold him into slavery, but he didn't know any of that. He was grieving over something that had happened in his mind only. It was not reality. And this applies to more than just the physical loss of someone through death. There are people that mourn over situations that there isn't any reality to it. You know, one of the common things that's said today, people will say, well, that's your truth, but this is my truth. And they just look at things differently, and they think that some people are just free to interpret things the way they want to. And some people have looked at themselves and have bought into the lie that they're a loser, that nothing will ever work for them. That's not what God's Word says. That is not consistent with what God says about you. And yet there are some people that have bought into that, and they are just mourning because of it. There are people that, I saw this program about young girls, and they were talking about how that they want to be beautiful, and they want to be loved, and they want to be all of these things, which I'm not putting a premium on being ugly, but I'm saying that is not the most important thing. Proverbs chapter 31 says beauty is deceitful, or I may have misquoted that, but anyway, it talks about that there's things a lot more important than just being beautiful on the outside. It's the person on the inside. And yet there are some people that have had so much emphasis placed on the way you look, especially women in our society, that there are people that have bought into this lie that they're just ugly, and they live the rest of their life mourning over something that's really not important. And they aren't ugly. They may not be the beauty queen, but they aren't ugly, and they just mourn and they grieve over things that aren't true. You know, my mother, and I didn't grieve over this, but I had the potential of it. But my brother, he's got an IQ that's up there with Einstein's. I think his IQ was actually higher than Einstein's. And here I came along, and I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And anyway, my mother, she was a school teacher, so she had access to our tests that we took and the scores. And one time she was bragging about my brother Ray being this Einstein type of IQ. And so I said, well, what was my IQ? And she said, oh, you were 88, just 2 points above an idiot. And did you know she was just kidding with me? Later on, before she died, I happened to mention something about that. And she says, I never said that. And I said, oh, yes, you did. I remember the exact day she said it. She said, I must have been kidding. And anyway, it didn't scar me, and I didn't live my life thinking bad. I made all straight A's with maybe a couple of B's every once in a while, and that was without studying. If I'd have studied, I'm sure I could have been a straight A student. So anyway, it didn't warp me, it didn't wound me, it didn't destroy my life. But something like that, see, if I had just taken that and lived by that, that could have influenced my entire life, and I could have gone through my entire life mourning and grieving over something that wasn't even accurate. It was just something she said as a joke. And so the point is, here is Israel or Jacob mourning over something that didn't even happen, and he refused to be comforted. In verse 36, it says, "And the Midianites sold him into Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard," he's the one that bought him. And so then we have, that's the end of chapter 37, and we come to a little bit of an interlude in this, where we go into talking about Judah committing incest with his daughter-in-law Tamar in the 38th chapter. So that's the end of the 37th chapter, and that means I only have 1,152 more chapters to go in the Bible.